welcome, Professor. We're so glad that we could all make this happen. And like we mentioned earlier, and we've used your text, and it's just the most brilliant read among, of course, all the other books. But this is something that I think almost everyone on the call has in common when I say that the examples that we've read are just amazing and mind-blowing. So we can't wait to hear more from you. And we can start if you're ready.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was very pleased to get the invitation and to accept it. Yeah, I love talking to students about these ideas. Professor Kulkarni said that I should talk to the students about how to think like an economist. I think the essence of economic thinking is how to make the best of what limited opportunities you have. There's never enough to do everything we want to do, and so doing more of one thing necessarily means doing less of some other thing we want to do, and figuring out how to navigate those trade-offs is really the essence of it. And so I thought I would try to look back on 50 years of teaching and tell you about things that I thought might be useful to you. And that itself was an example of having to figure out what would be more useful and what would be less useful. The time slot doesn't permit me to talk about all the things that I think it might be useful for you to hear about. So it was a good exercise for me in thinking like an economist. I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope this technology works. It usually does. We experimented and it worked when we tried it. I hope everyone can see a stack of books. Those are some of the books I've had the good fortune to be able to write over the years. I can't tell you very much about what's in any one of them. The green one in the middle is the one you'd probably know most about. I will take one example from that book in a few moments, but the same way of thinking about the world animated me in writing each of these books. And there's a few nuggets that I think would be especially useful to pass on. I wanted to choose a title for my talk, and I chose, Frankly Speaking. That was the title of a column I wrote in a humor magazine.
Professor, I think you've gone on mute.
How would I have gone on mute?
No, now it's fine. Now we can hear you again.
How did that happen? I didn't do anything to put myself on mute. It's just another a thing that the technology does to you when you're not looking. Yeah. So I will try to speak frankly to you. I will not try to soften the message where it needs to be hard-edged, but basically that's the plan for the talk. Let me see. I want to begin by issuing a few statements of gratitude. There's a very interesting literature that I summarized in my most recent book about the experience of the emotion of gratitude. In economics, we often say that more of one thing means less of another. In the case of the experience of the emotion of gratitude, that's one example where that doesn't seem to be quite true. The research findings indicate very clearly that the more you experience the emotion of gratitude, the more you're able to experience virtually every other good thing that you might want to experience. You enjoy better health, you enjoy better relationships with others like you more. People are often reluctant to admit that they were fortunate in the achievements they've had. They feel others won't respect them as much or like them as much. No, that's not true. If you're humble about what you've achieved and you recognize clearly that it's very easy to imagine different circumstances in which you wouldn't have had the opportunity to do any of those things, people don't like you less, they like you more. So I'm going to express some gratitude for a few things that I have experienced in the hope that that will make you like me more, because there's also research that shows that if you like the speaker, you're more receptive to the message of the speaker. So this picture here is of Edward M. Ned Gramlich. Ned Gramlich was a visitor to Cornell. He came during my 4th year as an assistant professor there. Up until that time, I had published no papers after arriving at Cornell. I had published one paper that I'd written in graduate school, but somebody with a record like that today would be fired from his post without hesitation. As it happened, I was doing a good job in the introductory course. That was a big course with hundreds of students. It was very difficult to staff successfully, and so they decided to keep me on for another 3 years and then fire me. Ned Gramlich was one of the few who took an interest in my work. He offered me an opportunity to publish a paper in a volume he was editing. I eagerly accepted the opportunity and wrote a paper, the best paper I could write, and gave it to him. He came back a few days later with a very sad look on his face to report to me that the publisher had called to tell him that the volume had been canceled. Bad luck, I thought, but on a lark, I sent the paper to Econometrica, and then not 2 months later, I got a letter back from Econometrica saying, we accept your paper with no demands for substantive revisions. Here are a few formatting things you need to change. I went to Germany that summer. I wrote 3 more papers. I sent them off to top journals. They got accepted, bang, bang, bang. And so before another year passed, I had a record that made it very difficult for them to fire me. I was the very last of 7 people hired the year I came. They've never hired 7 people before or since. And so I think it's fair to say that I got my job at Cornell by the skin of my teeth. The only other offer I had was an offer at a very small school in the Midwest. I would not have had an opportunity to go to all the wonderful conferences I've been invited to get all the research grants I've got, to get to write a New York Times column for many years. I got to spend a week with the Dalai Lama in India. All the things I got to do just by the slimmest of margins. The good fortune of this man coming into my life. Sad to say, he died in 2007. I wish he could have enjoyed them. This is another person to whom I'm extremely grateful. It's my friend and co-author, Tom Gilovich. He's a professor in the psychology department here at Cornell. When we were playing our weekly tennis game in 2007 on a Saturday morning in November, he later told me that during a changeover in the second set, as we sat on the bench waiting to resume play, I fell off the bench and lay motionless on the tennis court. He knelt to investigate what's the matter. He discovered I wasn't breathing. I had no pulse. He hollered out for somebody to call the emergency services, and he immediately began pounding on my chest. You've all seen it done in the movies or on television. He had no training to do this, but he went immediately into action. And after he said what seemed like forever, he got a very weak cough out of me. He was encouraged and kept pounding. He'd been told by a graduate student from Israel that if you don't break the victim's breastbone, you weren't trying hard enough. So he was pounding really hard. But he lost me yet again. No pulse, no breathing. Suddenly, in through the doors of the tennis facility came an ambulance crew, and they cut my shirt off me and put the electric paddles on my chest and shocked me back to life. They rushed me off to the hospital. I was flown in a helicopter to a larger hospital in Pennsylvania. They put me on ice overnight. I'm aware of none of this. I discovered 4 days later in the hospital, the doctor told me I had suffered an episode of sudden cardiac death. It's also called sudden cardiac arrest. you're dead for at least for the time being. It's a philosophical question, I guess, whether you're really dead, but you're, for all intents and purposes, dead. And most people remain dead when they experience that. You need to be revived in very short order. He said about 1% of people who experience this kind of episode survive, and you don't want to meet most of them. They're very severely damaged. The brain shouldn't go without oxygen. And I'm told too that for 3 days in the hospital after I awoke from whatever ice bath they had me in overnight, I was speaking unintelligible. I was just repeating myself over and over again. I have no memory of any of this. Then I am told by family members, they must have been horribly worried about what they were going to have to deal with for the coming years, that a neurologist came to examine me. He said, I'm going to give you a simple list of 3 words, and I'll come back later in our conversation and ask whether you can recall what they were. Apparently I said, okay, fine. And he gave me the 3 words, hat, shoe, pen, and later he asked me what were the 3 words, and I didn't even remember that he had told me he was going to ask me about 3 words, and of course I had absolutely no idea what the 3 words were. So it was a very discouraging situation, I can only imagine, for my wife and kids witnessing all of this. But then on day 4, I woke up with a clear head. They can't explain what happened. And when your computer freezes, sometimes the solution is turn it off and then turn it back on. Maybe something like that happened. But everything seemed in order on day 4. I was discharged from the hospital. I went for a big dinner on Thanksgiving, our big holiday in November, at the home of Tom and his wife, Karen. And there were 19 people present. The next day, for Friday, Karen called me and asked me how I was feeling. I said, I'm feeling fine. And then I said, let me see if I can name all the 19 people around the dinner table. And I went around the whole table in my memory and named everyone in the order they were seated. And so I thought, well, I'm okay. A few weeks later, under the Christmas tree was a box. It said, had my name on it. It said, The Great Triumvirate. I opened the box eagerly, and inside were 3 items, this Tilly hat, a cross pen, and a little clay tennis shoe that my wife had molded out of clay. And in the family, it had become a running joke that I couldn't even remember that he'd asked me about 3 words, much less what the 3 words were. And so all well. In January, a few weeks later, I was scheduled to go back to Pennsylvania for a follow-up exam with the same neurologist who had examined me in November. And I was a little worried about that. Would I be able to do okay on whatever exam I faced? If you're an academic, you don't want to have a sign around your neck saying mentally deficient. And so I said to my wife, give me 3 words, I'll see if I can remember them. And she said, shoe, box, squirrel. And 5 minutes passed, and I said, aren't you going to ask me about the words? She said, yeah, what were the words? I said, well, could you remember what they were? And she could not. Try this test sometime. It's harder than you think. So I said to her confidently, the 3 words were shoe, box, squirrel. And so we drove down to Pennsylvania. I was feeling like I'm going to do fine on this test. We met with the neurologist. It was, of course, the same man as before, and he told me yet again, I'm going to give you 3 words to hold in memory. You'll tell me what they are when I ask you about them in a few minutes. I said, okay. And he then said, hat, shoe, pen. And my wife and I looked at each other. It was all we could do to keep from laughing. It was, of course, the same 3 words he had used in November. But I thought about it, I said, of course he would use the same 3 words. How's he going to remember what the 3 words are if he uses different ones each time? So he comes back 5 minutes later and said, what are the 3 words I asked you to remember? And for a moment, my mind went completely blank. I had a feeling of panic. Oh, I'm not going to be able to remember. I couldn't remember them. I'm going to get an F on this test, and then what? And then suddenly this image of the three items from the box popped into my head, and I said to him confidently, hat, shoe, pen. He said, "You're doing fine." So I got out of there. I don't have any black mark on my record. I don't know if I if I would have gotten out of there except for this memory aid that I had at my disposal. But I'm very, very grateful that the reason I'm even here today was yet another stroke of good fortune. Normally, if you don't get help immediately, you don't come out of an episode of sudden cardiac death. An ambulance arrived so quickly on the scene only because 30 minutes before this all happened, there had been auto accidents near the scene of the tennis court. There were 2 ambulances dispatched to attend to people hurt in those accidents. One of the accidents didn't involve any serious injuries, and so the driver of that ambulance had been able to divert to the tennis facility nearby and attend to me. Except for that quirk of fate, I'm not here today. I'll also express a quick word of gratitude to Casper Wirtz. He was my teacher in biology in the 11th grade. He taught me to see the world in a new light. We learned some basics of Darwinian theory, and when you go for a walk in nature, you see things you didn't even notice before if you have a few simple theoretical principles to guide your attention. So why do some trees lose their leaves in winters, other not? Why in most vertebrate species are the males so much bigger than the females? Here shown in the slide are elephant seals. It's the bull on the right, the cow on the left. The bull weighs 6,000 pounds, 5 times as much as the cow. Why is the bull so much heavier than the cow? The reason is not that it's good for bulls as a group to be big. It's much more work to eat enough to achieve that body mass and maintain it. They're much less mobile because they're so big. They're much more vulnerable to predation from the great white shark, their main threat. They suffer from arthritis at earlier ages. It would be much better if they could all push a button at the count of 3 and be as small as the females. But the reason they're as big as they are is that as in most vertebrate species, they're polygynous. The males take more than one mate if they can. And the if they can qualifier is important. If some take more than one mate, that means others don't get any. That's the ultimate loser position in the Darwinian scheme of things. And so, of course, the males do everything they can to gain access to females. And that means fighting with one another, often bitterly for hours on end on the beach. And if you're bigger than your rival, you're more likely to win each of those battles. And genes that mutant genes that selected for slightly larger size were greatly favored up to a point. They didn't grow to weigh 10,000 pounds. They weigh 6,000 pounds. This was the beginning of my economic naturalist writing assignment. If you can use a simple set of principles to help you notice what's going on in the world, you will get to be better at thinking in terms of those principles for your entire life. We have evidence that the typical economics course leaves no lasting imprint on students. 6 months after they take our typical introductory course, students don't do any better on tests that probe their knowledge of basic economic principles than other students who never even took the course. What a horrible performance that is. And I think the reason is we just try to teach students far too much. We put every idea that we've ever had in front of them, and it all goes by in a blur. Nobody remembers anything. If you'll just exploit the fact that a very short list of basic principles does most of the heavy lifting in economics, and you confront students with example after example that illustrates vividly from contexts that are familiar to them from experience, and then have them go out and do original versions of those same examples, then they become lifelong economics teachers. They get better at economics every year they remain on this earth, and they transmit their knowledge to other people, getting better in the process. The explanations that we offer sound good. Are they really the right ones? Well, what about Darwin's explanation for why the bull elephant seal is so big? We can test that explanation not by looking for other examples in which the males are bigger than the females. That wouldn't prove that the explanation was right. It might be true for some altogether unrelated reason to the explanation. If we want to test an explanation, we look for circumstances in which the explanation wouldn't apply. And in some bird species, birds mate for life. They're monogamous. It's not true in those species that the males take as many mates as they can. And so if the males aren't fighting with one another for access to females, there's no advantage evolutionarily to be bigger than your rival. And so in monogamous species, the prediction that males would be bigger would not hold. And so here, sure enough, in the albatross, you can scarcely tell the difference between the males and the females. They live for many years, they mate for life. The males and the females are virtually identical in experience. That's the exception that proves the rule, which always seemed to me like an odd saying. How does the exception prove the rule? The exception contradicts the rule. And it was pointed out by a linguist once that to understand this saying, you have to understand the sense of the verb to prove in the Old English sense. It's the exception that tests the rule, not that demonstrates the truth of the rule. So we experimented before the session started, and we finally were able to get the sound to work in this video. My co-authors, Ben Bernanke, Ori Hefetz, and Kate Antonovic, are producing, with the help of a professional video firm in New York City, some short videos, 2 or 3 minutes long each, that illustrate the economic naturalist concept. This example is not one that's in the book. It'll take 2 minutes to play, and I think it's worth 2 minutes of our time. Let me hit play on and see what you think.
Why are rotisserie chickens less expensive than fresh chickens? Have you ever walked through your local supermarket and wondered how they could sell a fully cooked rotisserie chicken for less money than a fresh, uncooked chicken? It just doesn't seem to make sense. So why would the supermarket do this? The answer lies in the economics of how demand and supply interact in grocery store delis and meat departments.
Fresh chickens in the meat department.
The demand for fresh chickens varies from day to day and can be hard to predict. So rather than risk running out, supermarkets tend to order more than they expect to sell on average. But when the inevitable periods of unexpectedly low demand occur, it is not in either the supermarket's or the consumer's interest to allow unsold fresh chickens to spoil. So when unsold fresh chickens begin to approach their sell-by dates, supermarkets put them in the rotisserie and offer them at a discount in roasted form rather than simply discarding them. Days of unexpectedly low demand for fresh chickens are thus also days of unexpectedly high supply of rotisserie chicken. And that's why stores offer roasted chickens at such low prices. And if the rotisserie chicken doesn't sell out, the roasted meat can be used to make higher priced items like chicken salad or chicken soup for the store's deli counter. The incentive to reduce waste and creatively offer more items from the original fresh chicken unlocks hidden value. And since all supermarkets can follow this strategy, competition ensures that the resulting value is then passed on to customers in the form of lower prices.
What's useful about these examples, I think, is that the brain has a built-in algorithm that says if you don't see something multiple times, And if you don't use it actively, don't use scarce brain capacity to worry about it. And so, you know, we've got terabytes of information bombarding us every day. And if you don't hear it 2 or 3 times, you just ignore it. And if you don't use it, you don't really develop any facility with it. And the beauty of these examples is that because they're interesting, because the questions make you say to yourself, yeah, why is that? They are what I think of as conversational nuggets. When you go home from school for the holidays, you talk about them with your relatives around the holiday dinner tables. You are with friends and there's a lull in the conversation. You can pose one of these questions and then suddenly everybody wants to hear you talk about. And every time you talk about one of these examples, the ideas that the example illustrates get embedded a little bit more deeply into your neural circuitry, and you're able to apply them afresh in new circumstances that you haven't seen before. So it's been my career-long hope that people would embrace this assignment in their economics courses, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to learn that many of you in India are doing this. This is enormously gratifying to me. I've got limited time, so I thought I would want to talk to you about the idea that I've worked with over the decades that I think is the one with the most important consequences for human welfare. And it's an idea that I really do associate with Darwin more than with anyone else. I think of his central insight being that life is graded on the curve. It's not how fast you are, how smart you are, how strong you are. None of that matters. What matters is how those traits compare with the people that you're competing against. If you're smarter than your rival, you'll prevail. If you're faster than your rival, you'll prevail. That's what really matters. And that changes our view of the consequences of competitive dynamics in economics. The context shapes every evaluation that humans make. Are we there yet? Are we almost there yet? You're driving with your daughter to see her grandparents. 10 miles remain on your journey. Are we almost there yet? Well, if 10 miles remain on a 12-mile journey, you'll say, no, we just started. We've got a long way to. If 10 miles remain on a 300-mile journey, you say, we're virtually there. Everything is shaped by context. I was 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer living in a house with no running water, no electricity, 2 rooms. If I lived in a house like that here in the United States, I would be ashamed for my friends to see where I lived. Never for one moment when I was living in that house in Nepal did it seem in any way like an unsatisfactory house. It was a totally satisfactory house. I received guests there with pride. It served every need that I imagined a house having in that context. If my friends from Nepal would see my house here in Ithaca, that's a picture of it, they would be astonished that a person would feel a need to live in such a house. Why would anybody need such a grand house as that? Why so many bathrooms? What's the problem here? They would wonder, but my friends here wouldn't have that reaction at all. Most of them live in houses that are bigger than mine. Every context is local. Every context has its own standards, and that shapes what we feel we need, what we buy, what we don't buy. All those things are very heavily influenced by the simple fact that context shapes our evaluations in this simple, basic way. That's true as well for people who have vastly more wealth than I do. The people in the middle class think it's shameful that the rich build such houses as these, but that's the same reaction that my Nepali friends would have had if they saw my house. It's shameful that I would need such a house as that. In the circles of the rich, these houses are normal. If you don't have a house like this and you're very wealthy, you can't entertain in the style in which people have grown accustomed. And so these houses have an effect on people elsewhere in the income ladder through a process I call expenditure cascades. The people in the middle aren't made angry when they see pictures of these houses. They actually rather like seeing pictures of the mansions and the yachts and the helicopters. Maybe they'll be rich someday. What's it going to be like when I'm rich and able to have a house like this? The people just below the top are the ones who are influenced by these houses. They attend the wedding receptions of the daughters of the families who live in these houses, which are held at home now, not in a hotel or a country club. And the people just below the top leave thinking, now we need a bigger house. We need a ballroom that can accommodate 200 guests. They build bigger. And their friends just below them come for dinner. They leave thinking, now we need a dining room that will seat 18, not just 12. They build bigger. And it cascades all the way down the income ladder. And without reference to this expenditure cascade, there's simply no way to explain why the median new house built in the United States is now 50% bigger than it was in the 1970s. There's no way to explain why we're spending so much more on weddings, 3 times as much in real terms as in 1980. Are people happier because people are spending more? No, it's now been shown in at least one paper that the people who spend dramatically more on their weddings are more likely to divorce each year than the people who spend at more modest rates. I know this has been an issue in India as well. There have been attempts to rein in expenditures of this sort. People would spend more than was prudent on funeral occasions, and there were attempts to regulate that. All these things, I think intuitively we know that when everybody spends more, it simply raises the bar that defines what we consider necessary or adequate. It wouldn't matter that we're spending money on extra things in this way if there were nothing else useful that we could do with the money. But of course, that's not true. In the United States, we have horrible, dilapidated infrastructure. We're not a poor country. We could afford to have state-of-the-art infrastructure, but every year bridges and roads collapse, people are killed. We could spend the money that it takes to build bigger mansions, that's real resources. Those same construction workers could be fixing the infrastructure. That would be much more useful to everybody. The people in the bigger mansions, if those mansions were smaller, wouldn't be less happy. Probably they would be more happy. Why? Because it's a pain in the neck to manage such a big property. If everybody had a smaller one, they wouldn't feel they needed such a big one, and they would be happier and healthier as well. We could spend more money on medical research and hospital surge capacity. The private business model of providing medical services doesn't favor those investments, but collectively we could make them, and when the next pandemic comes, we would be very glad we had made them. There is, in short, a whole host of ways we could spend the money we now spend on private consumption that beyond a certain point, certainly here in the United States and most other rich countries, beyond a certain point, that money is purely wasteful. It doesn't make anybody any healthier or happier, and it's resources that could be used to buy things that would actually matter in people's lives. There is enormously useful expenditures we could make in the climate domain. This is Ellicott City, Maryland. They experienced a 1,000-year flood in 2016. What's a 1,000-year flood? It's one that is expected to occur only once every 1,000 years. In 2018, they experienced a second 1,000-year flood. Those aren't supposed to happen every 2 years. We are seeing flooding and wildfires and storms and droughts all over the world occurring with greater frequency and intensity. We know how to fix those problems. We have the technology. It's just the money to invest in those technologies that we haven't been willing to spend. We could spend that money without giving up anything that matters. We in this country have just begun to become sensitive to the centuries of racial abuse that people have experienced in this country. We need to spend money fixing those problems, the enormous inequality, the enormous disparity of resources. We could address those problems with the resources we have without demanding painful sacrifices from anyone. We don't do it. Cory Booker, one of our senators, has a plan to give each baby an annual bond account contribution. We could reduce the inequalities of wealth enormously in one lifetime if we were to adopt this policy. We haven't done it. Why? Because it would be very expensive to do it. Where would we get the money? That's an easy question, it turns out, to answer. So that's my big idea. Higher taxes could pay for public investments whose value, even to the wealthy, would exceed their loss from the corresponding declines in private consumption. It's a free lunch. In economists, we say there's no free lunch. Well, there is a free lunch. We could do all these things and not demand painful sacrifices from anyone. But that raises this question. If we could do that, why don't we do it? Why don't the wealthy vote for politicians who would do that? They don't. They vote for politicians who not only won't raise their taxes to finance the investments I just described, they spend money to keep those politicians out of office and elect other politicians who will reduce their taxes. This is completely a contradiction of my hypothesis. If those investments would make even the wealthy better off, why aren't the wealthy in favor of them? Some wealthy, of course, are in favor of them, but most wealthy seem to oppose them. And I'm going to share my attempt at an answer to that question with you. It's because I think the wealthy suffer from the mother of all cognitive illusions, I call it. First, a word or two about cognitive illusions generally. This is the so-called checker shadow illusion. Ask yourself, which square looks darker, square A or square B? If your brain is like mine, it will be telling you, oh, that's an easy question. Square A is obviously darker. Since I'm talking to you about illusions, you're already suspicious probably that it's a trick, and it is a trick. In fact, square A and square B are exactly the same square shade of gray. There is not a scintilla of difference in the shading of them. But again, if you look at the illustration carefully, if your brain is like mine, it's telling you that can't possibly be right. Here's the explanation, and it sounds plausible. It's that the same amount of light enters your eye from the two squares. It's sent to the visual processing centers of the brain at the same intensity. But the brain, before reaching a judgment about the relative shades of gray on squares A and B, adds an additional piece of information. It knows, it can see from the drawing, that square B lies in the shadow of the cylinder. And we know from experience that objects that lie in shadow are lighter in color than they appear to be. And so the brain, unbidden by any conscious effort on our part, makes an automatic adjustment. It tells us that square B is lighter than square A. That's exactly what you would want your brain to do. You want your brain to tell you what's going on out there in the world, and that's what your brain quite plausibly thinks is going on out there in the world when it sees this image. That sounds totally reasonable to me. I respect the logic of that explanation, but I still said, well, okay, it's still a trick. Square A and square B can't be the same hue. Only when I got my graphics program out and made a strip joining square A and square B was I able finally to admit to myself, wow, they really are the same color. How can it be that it was such a confident belief I had that they couldn't be? I take a few moments with this just because I think it's an important, humbling example. It's possible to believe something has to be true, even though it isn't true. Why? Not because we're stupid, not because we're defective in some way. It's because the world's a complicated place. We employ all sorts of heuristics and shortcuts to figure out what's going on. Those heuristics work reasonably well most of the time, but they're not perfect. And so it's quite possible that in our normal cognitive assessments, we'll be wrong about something, even though it seems utterly impossible that we could be wrong based on what we've seen. All right, so with that idea in mind, let's confront the problem of a wealthy person trying to assess whether an increase in his taxes will harm him. He's not worried whether he won't be able to buy everything he needs. Of course, rich people face no threat of that happening. What are they worried about? They're worried about not being able to buy the special extras that they want. So how will higher taxes affect me? The normal cognitive routine we would go through when trying to answer a question like this is try to remember the last time the event we're worried about happened. How did I feel then? We're going to go to a Disney theme park. Should we do that? Well, what happened the last time we went to a theme park? Did we have a good time? If yes, we're more likely to go. All right, so how did I feel the last time they raised my taxes? The problem with that normal strategy is that it doesn't work in the current environment. Why? Because tax rates have been going down year by year ever since World War II in most countries, here certainly. In 1966, the year I graduated from Georgia Tech, the top tax rate was 70%. It had been 92% during World War II. In Reagan's first term of office, it had fallen to 50%. 1987, it was 38%, a slight increase in 1995 during Clinton's administration. Now again, 37%. So if you want to think how higher taxes would affect you, you can't. You can't think of examples that would inform you on that. So what do? You go to plan B. We've got lots of strategies. Let's go to the next best one. We know that if our taxes go up, we'll have less money to spend. Who would argue against that claim? That's true by definition. So I'll think back to the last times I had less money to spend. How did I feel during those times? So unless you're really fortunate, no matter how wealthy you are, there will be times when you had less money than you did the year before. Maybe you had a bad business year, maybe you had a divorce, you might have had a home fire, you might have had a health crisis, maybe your son got arrested for a serious crime, you had to hire an expensive lawyer. All these things happen. You have to spend a lot of money unexpected. You have less money than before. How did you feel? Well, you don't wonder how you felt. You remember vividly how you felt. You felt awful. Those were all horrible, vivid memories. You don't want that to happen ever again, of course. What you don't remember vividly is that when those things happen to you, your income went down, but the incomes of other people like you were exactly the same as they had been. And if you're worried about not being able to afford life special extras, that's the key to understanding the cognitive illusion. Let's suppose you're a New Yorker. Of course, like all wealthy New Yorkers, you want a penthouse apartment with a sweeping view of Central Park. It would be wonderful to have that apartment. The problem, there aren't enough of them to go around. How do you get them? You have to outbid other people like you who also want them. And here's the key point. If your taxes go up and the taxes of other people like you go up, your relative bidding power is completely unaffected by that. Oh, you're worried that some foreign oligarch will come in and get the property and you won't? Then put a foreign transaction levy on sale of properties like this. You can end up with the same penthouse apartments in the same hands as before with a tax rate that's much, much higher than the current tax rate. Nobody has to make any painful sacrifices whatsoever. It's distressing to me to have reached my advanced age and not having succeeded in persuading the political system to embrace this view. There are people in the political system who have embraced this view, but so far This is not the dominant view in the political system. I hope I live long enough to see that change. I hope I live long enough to see this simple truth. Do you think this claim is untrue, that we could tax the wealthy and fund public investments that would make them better off without causing any harm to them? If you think that claim is untrue, which of the papers in the huge literature on the determinants of well-being do you want to challenge the validity of? We know that consumption beyond a certain point yields absolutely no measurable increase in human health, human satisfaction, any other dimension of human well-being. It is pure economic waste. We know that greater investments in human capabilities of a whole variety of other sorts yield lasting improvements in health, happiness, and other dimensions of well-being. This is a very simple claim. It's impossible, if you know the relevant literature, to raise any substantive objection to this claim, and yet this claim does not drive public policy decision-making in any country of the world entirely. It comes closer in the Nordic countries than in the United States and England, but there's much progress to be made here. Never waste a good crisis, as many political leaders have said. We find it very difficult to change any institutions in any country. There's an enormous status quo bias, loss aversion. Behavioral economists have explanations for that. The only times we can create meaningful changes are when there's great upheaval and it has become dramatically clear that current arrangements aren't working. Then we have a chance to make a change. We're at such a moment right now. We will face a choice going forward coming out of the pandemic. Shall we continue on our current course? That would be in the United States something like Society A, large house sizes, more expenditures each year on weddings, spending more and more on cars, fewer weeks of vacation, low investment in infrastructure, very meager investment in renewable energy and other climate mitigation measures, no hospital surge capacity building, income inequality remaining high, racial justice efforts remaining low. Or we could turn the corner on each of those. Which should we do? The evidence, as I say, is unambiguous that Society B would be more supportive of human health and well-being for rich and poor alike. This evidence will eventually be taught in elementary schools. Everybody will know it. If you vote for a politician who favors Society A, your grandchildren will know someday that you voted for Society A when the evidence was clear that Society B would have been better. How will you explain your vote to your grandchildren that you voted for Society A? I would not want to be faced with that task. It's a very simple set of choices that we face. My own students will know from having seen this diagram thousands of times in things I assign to them and in lectures I give in class, that efficiency is a very worthy concept to pursue. If you make the world more efficient, if you eliminate inefficiency, that, in a manner of speaking, is to make the economic pie bigger. If you can somehow make the economic pie bigger, it's always possible to carve it up in such a way that everybody can get a bigger slice than before. That's just simple, plain geometry that I learned about in the 10th grade. If you can make the pie bigger, everybody can get a bigger slice than before. So if we are pursuing policies now that result in a smaller pie, we should abandon them. We should switch from them to policies that will make the pie bigger, recognizing that we may have to intervene and make sure that everyone gets a bigger slice. Everyone won't automatically necessarily get a bigger slice, but we can design institutions and transfers that everybody will get a bigger slice. So that's what I had thought to try to put on your intellectual plate to think about today. I didn't mention this to the professors, but I am going to offer to share with you a PDF copy of my most recent book that talks about a lot of these issues. And so they will figure out a way that you can indicate that you would be interested in receiving a PDF copy of this book. And I will send the link that will get you, send them the PDF copy that it will enable them to get you access to it. It's free. You don't need to buy. If you feel guilty, you got it for free. Buy a gift copy for a niece or nephew and satisfy your guilty conscience that way. If you have one, that you don't need to feel guilty about getting a free book. It's a pleasure for me to think of you having the opportunity to think about these issues in spare time going forward. So that's the presentation. You're probably tired of hearing me drone on. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and the moderators will have figured out some way to figure out how to direct your questions to me if you have any.
Right. Thank you so much, for the book. I mean, wow. I myself can't wait to get my hands on it. But yes, of course, I will have a feeling of guilt. So for sure, I will buy another copy. But yeah, I can't wait to get my hands on the book. As the questions go, I have received a couple of questions from the students. I had asked them to send some if they had a particular question beforehand. And of course, I have questions of my own. And while I start with that, we can start taking questions in the chat box as well. So, okay, so I'll start with the first question that I had. Since we just, I mean, the last thing that we spoke about was about how it is possible to tax people above a certain income range, to levy a higher tax on them. I was just wondering that if you look at the truth of the matter, or if you look at what the evidence from public policy shows us, is the higher you tax people beyond a certain income range, will that not further incentivize them to either not to disclose income, or find loopholes in the tax policy, so to speak? And then does that also not sort of counter the entire Laffer's argument of higher taxes then lead to lower revenue collection? I mean, how would that play out?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked those questions. They are inevitably objections that are raised to any proposal to raise taxes on the wealthy. And it's absolutely true that if the tax rate goes up, the incentive to avoid taxes goes up in lockstep with it. Of course, that's true. And if the tax rate rises beyond a certain point, revenue collections will fall. Of course, that's true. If the tax rate were 100%, if we took all your income and put it into a pot and gave everybody an equal share, what would happen? People would eventually notice that whether you work or not, you have the same amount of money to spend. They would see their neighbors not working, taking vacations every day or going fishing every day. Why am I working when they're not working? And pretty soon, nobody would work, and the amount of income that we had to share would be zero. So yes, those objections are clearly true beyond a certain point. The question is always, in practical terms, where does that point kick in? And here, Arthur Laffer has absolutely no idea what he's talking about if he says that higher taxes from the current vantage point will cause any of these effects to occur. We have actually a lot of evidence on that. In California, the tax rate on top earners was raised by more than 50% in the last 2 decades. Why? Because the state was in deep budget deficit. The schools were being defunded. The infrastructure, which was once very high quality in California, was beginning to decay badly. The governor who came in raised taxes 50%. There were predictions, as inevitably there would be, that people would leave California for Nevada or Oregon or New York or somewhere where the tax rate would be lower. okay, let's see what happened. We now have a study from Stanford University that tracked economic mobility for people at every percentile rung on the economic ladder in California. And the people in the 99th percentile of the income distribution in California left the state at a lower rate than any other point on the 100 percentile scale. People live their lives in local environments. They experience, sure, if there's an oligarch somewhere who has more money than you, maybe you care about that a little bit. But if the trade-off is to have that oligarch have a little bit more money than you, and you have paved roads to drive on and hospitals with spare capacity when you get sick and a vaccine when you need it, if that's the trade-off, and in local terms, you don't feel any poorer than before because everyone else is paying the high tax rates. The evidence I outlined to you predicts that you wouldn't feel bad, and certainly that you wouldn't move out of state and try to start your life somewhere anew to solve that problem, and people don't. Countries that have high tax rates grow at faster rates, on the distribution of tax rates that we observe worldwide. It's the low tax countries that grow less rapidly than the high tax countries. Over time, periods of higher taxes experience higher growth than periods of lower taxes. There's a lot of evidence against the simple Laffer objections. Of course, we need to build enforcement mechanisms. Here in the United States, Republicans in Congress cut the budget of the tax authorities dramatically for the last 10 years. And of course, there's much more tax cheating going on now. Those budgets should be increased. We've shown that when you increase those budgets by $1, the direct effect is to get $4 more of tax revenue. Why cut those budgets? But that's just the direct effect. When people see that their peers are cheating, they feel like chumps if they don't cheat. And so the indirect effects are vastly bigger than the direct effects. You cut that budget by $1, you lose not $4, but probably $40 in revenue over time. So yeah, those are objections we inevitably hear, and I'm glad you asked about them. But you really have to look at them critically in the context of the evidence that we have that bears on them.
Right. Yes, Ashish, you have a question. You're on mute.
I'll take the other side of the debate, or the other end of the spectrum, so to speak. So, Professor Frank, the ability to successfully prioritize and complete the most important public projects depends on the political process, which is completely unaffected by the amount of tax revenue. So even if you end up collecting more tax, won't the political process end up choosing those projects that are politically more popular rather than more desirable from an economic perspective?
So we have a big academic school that has for many years been influential in this country. It's present everywhere, the Public Choice School. And their vision of the world is that government consists of people who are opportunistic, who serve their own ends, not the public's ends. And of course, there are bridges to nowhere built in every jurisdiction. If you don't keep a careful eye on government, people will make mischief and waste the public money. And so, of course, that's a problem that we need to focus on. That's the role of a free press. That's the role of campaign finance reform. That's the role of having a good government is a very difficult thing. We have to work hard at building the institutions that create a responsible government. But every year, there's an institute in Berlin that does a survey of public opinion across countries. How do you feel about your government? Do they deliver valuable public services? Do you feel your tax rates are being put to good use? And so on. Every year there are a dozen countries at the top of the list. That they include Canada, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden. Citizens in those countries feel that their governments deliver good value for their tax dollars. The press freedom is very high in those countries. The campaign finance issues are well regulated in those countries. Where those issues are not well attended to, we get more corruption in government. But even in the United States, where those issues are not well dealt with, the vast majority of government budgets go for transfer payments to people who need money. They go for infrastructure. They go for things that voters really care about. So yes, is there waste? Sure, there's waste, but we can keep waste to a minimum. But it requires effort, and the effort's well spent.
Indeed. Thank you.
All right. So this is with reference to your book, Success and Luck. So it's a two-part question that I have. The first is that, so you speak a lot about how, and you've given examples of even Bill Gates and how he's one of the few people to recognize that luck does play a huge role in how successful one is. So why do you think we as people in general, when we're doing well, we tend to underestimate the role that luck has? And usually when things go south in life, that's where you start sort of blaming things that, or I wasn't lucky enough. But when it's something that I've achieved, it's immediately your own hard work, and it's not luck that played a role. And a follow-up question to that would be then, so you also gave reference to, I believe when you were in Nepal, there was a cook who was really, like a very, very talented person, and who could have done very well in life, but you say that he was still stuck with the subsistence wage simply because of the country he was in, that there was only that well that he could do for himself given the economic situation that the country was in. So then what would you say is for students living in India right now, I mean, and everyone on our call, would you say that they're really lucky to live in the country right now, given the context of the world, worldwide job market and the skill sets that are required, and how much of an onus or, of an importance would luck play in probably shaping their careers going forward, and how should they look at it?
Yeah, those are great questions. My friend Tom Gilovich actually contributed a very important idea that helps us understand this tendency to overlook the role of luck in any success that we enjoy. He and his collaborators have done work on the asymmetry with which we think about headwinds and tailwinds, the concepts. If you Google headwinds and then do an image search on that term, you will see vivid images that exactly capture the concept of a headwind. It's something you battle against, you're conscious of it every moment. So if you're riding a bike and there's a strong headwind, you're annoyed by that. You are very conscious of the fact that it's making your attempts to get where you're going much more difficult. It's like riding up a hill. You turn to go back to your original starting point, and now you have a tailwind, and it feels wonderful. That headwinds, but that feeling lasts for what, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Then you ride along with a tailwind. You're completely unconscious of the fact that you have a tailwind. And that's not mysterious. When you have a headwind, you have to actively battle against it. When you have a tailwind, you don't have to do anything. It helps you. You're not conscious of it. And that simple asymmetry permeates all activity. If you confront difficulties in your career, you remember them vividly. All the problems that were so difficult that you had to solve, all the formidable rivals you had to defeat on your path to the top, those are vivid in your memory until the day you die. What about the teacher in the 11th grade who kept you out of trouble when you were about to go astray? You forgot about that, or maybe the first promotion you got was because a colleague who would have gotten the promotion had to stay and care for an ailing parent. You forgot that too. And so when you think about your success, most people who succeed are very talented. They've worked hard. And so, of course, they can think of examples of hard work and skill that help them get to the top. Those traits did help them get to the top. they're less likely to remember the lucky breaks that they enjoyed along the path to the top. And without those, there are lots of people who are talented and hardworking who don't get to the top. What about those people? Why aren't they successful? Well, they weren't as lucky as you were. And it's good to be cognizant of that fact. I think the wealthy seem to resent it if you remind them that they were lucky along the way. They don't like that. Maybe they think that diminishes their achievement in some way. But if you ask them whether they can remember examples of good fortune that they enjoyed in their life, they don't seem offended by that simple question. They think about it. They get excited when they can think of an example. They tell you about it. Then that kindles the memory of another example. They tell you about it too. And then suddenly they're asking, why aren't we investing more in the schools? Why aren't we spending more money to help others succeed? My cook in Nepal was, as you mentioned, extremely talented. It saddens me to think that there was no outlet for his talent. You really need opportunity in addition to talent in order to achieve your full potential. And there, I think the picture in India is dramatically different from when I first started teaching. We had some of my best students were people who had left India to come to study in the United States. Most of them at that time stayed in the United States. They sought academic positions in universities here. They went into positions in industry because the opportunities were so much better here than they were in India. Now, many of those best students do not stay here. They go back to India because there is such a perceived opening of opportunity in your country now. And that's hugely gratifying for me to see. I hope it continues. I know there are political problems to work through to keep opportunity open, but you know that's the human struggle.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that partially one of the reasons why students come back probably is also because of the changed visa rules, but well, that's one side of the story. But of course, we do see a lot of people coming back these days simply because of the kind of work that can be done here. That's right. So this has been a repeated question by a lot of the students. So I'm just going to combine and ask it. So like we told you, a lot of the students in the first year also undertake the assignment of writing an essay, similar to what you did and went on to compile the book. And so I have faced this, and I'm sure Ashish, you can add to this as well, that when we gave them the assignment first, I would always get students come to me and say that, how do you know that's the right question? Like, what is a right question? How do you go about selecting a question which you will like? And I said, the point is not to come up with a question that I like. You need to find it interesting, and you need to be able to pick one basic economic concept that describes it. So a lot of our students would like to know that, over the years, which has been the most surprising or interesting question or essay topic that has been selected by a student of yours? And secondly, did they always end up with the right answer at the first shot, or would you go back to them and would ask them to work on it again, and eventually they would get there, and the quality of the essay is what we read in the book? So was it a work in progress, or were these the ones that were just brilliant to begin with?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked those questions. In making the assignment, I stressed to students that it's not easy to come up with an interesting question. The assignment is pose an interesting question based on something that you have either personally experienced or at least observed personally, and then use basic economic concepts in an attempt to craft a plausible answer to it. That's the assignment. And I say, coming up with an interesting question is really the hardest part of the assignment. You see the examples in the book. They have in common, or at least I tried to ensure that they had in common, the quality that when you hear them, you immediately say, yeah, why would that be? I say, don't pose a question like, why is it when we've been up all night studying for an exam, the next evening we order out for pizza? And the answer is, well, because we're tired and it's hard to cook when you're tired. That's a correct answer to the question, but the question is not an interesting question. It's so obvious that nobody would say, yeah, why is that? They'd say, idiot. Of course, it's because we're tired. It's more costly to cook when you're tired. I won't want to go running down the hall and knock on my colleague's door and say, listen to this question. You know, he's going to think I'm crazy if I repeat that question to him. The way to tell if you have an interesting question, first of all, is it interesting to you? If it's interesting to you, that's the main thing to be concerned with. But if you want additional evidence, pose the question to your classmates and watch how they react. If their eyes glaze over, that's not a good sign. If they immediately light up and say, why is that? If they immediately start offering ideas about why that is. One of my favorite examples is one from a student who wanted to know, why is it that the regulators force you to strap your toddler into a car safety seat when you drive 2 blocks to the supermarket, but you can fly from Delhi to New York with your toddler sitting loose on your lap? That was his question. And of course, the cost-benefit principle is the basic tool that most students use to try to answer questions like that. And so he said when he would pose that question, people did seem interested, but their immediate reaction was that it was because if the plane crashes, you're all going to die anyway. What does it matter if the kid's strapped in? And he thought about that. And he said, no, that can't be the right answer, because in the early days of aviation travel, commercial aviation travel, they required seatbelts, not to protect you if the plane crashes. That's, of course, you're all very likely to die if the plane crashes. But turbulence was a sufficiently frequent event in early aviation that you were much more likely to be injured in an airplane flight from turbulence than you were to be injured in a car trip from an accident. So seatbelts were required in planes long before they were required in cars. That wasn't until the 1970s or 80s that we started requiring them in cars. And so he realized that if the benefits of being strapped in are greater in a plane than in a car, it can't be because of the benefit side of the cost-benefit test that explains the regulatory asymmetry. It's got to be on the cost side. And sure enough, a moment's reflection on that reveals that if you have a car seat already set up in the back of your car, it's free to strap your kid in, just the few moments it takes to do it. If you're on a full flight from Delhi to New York, you got to buy an extra ticket to strap your kid into a car seat. That could be what? Thousands of rupees additional expense. And so the regulators say, well, it would be nice if you could strap your kid in the plane, but it's too expensive. We're not going to require it. Nobody wants to say that out loud, but that's the reason. Is that the right reason? I believe it is, but I tell students their answer should pass the smell test. It shouldn't be obviously wrong. It should be plausible. At least the cost-benefit explanation you give should fit the facts as we see them on the table. If it's the wrong answer by some ultimate research finding, okay, this is not a PhD thesis. The whole point of asking you to write an interesting question is that then you'll want to talk about it. You want to tell your friends about it. You want to tell your family members about it. I share the most interesting examples with the class, and so then they all talk about the most interesting ones. They're more likely to talk about the interesting ones than the less interesting ones. And the more you talk about them, the better you internalize the concepts that we're trying to get into your brains.
Oh, okay. Anusha has a question.
Yes, Professor. So I wanted to ask you, this was in relation to your paper that you'd co-authored, which was Does Teaching Economics Inhibit Cooperation? This is about, I think, 40 years old now, but I'm hoping you can remember. So given the findings of your paper, have you had reason to believe that profession has acknowledged, or for that matter, taken heed of the recommendations that you make in that paper, which is, to increase the way that social cooperation acts out in among students of economics? And moreover, what makes you hopeful, if at all, for the development of such an attitude in the future?
Yeah, I think the economics profession today is much different from what it was when I wrote that paper, certainly, and from what it had been for decades before that. It's still true that I think economists are a little different from others. They do tend to have a more jaundiced view of human nature on average than people in other areas, but it's less extreme than it used to be. There has been a behavioral economics revolution in the last 3 or 4 decades. Most of that work has been based on what I think of as the cognitive errors literature. People make mistakes. I gave you an example of the kind of mistake we make in the checker shadow illusion. Those are real issues. People do make mistakes. I think the part of what I hoped would become behavioral economics and occupy equal footing with the cognitive errors literature hasn't yet done so. That would be the Darwinian influenced ideas, the ideas that flow from life is graded on the curve, that insight, and therefore there are all sorts of arms races that are functionally wasteful that we could do something about. That's one idea. The Darwinian idea that selfish behavior needs to be understood more broadly, that if you're not somebody who puts his own interests aside in the interests of the common good, and others can discern that quality in you, then nobody's going to want you on your team, and nobody succeeds today unless you're a member of a high functioning team. And so yeah, I think those ideas have not reached full maturity among economists, but they're making progress. And we take satisfaction from seeing changes happen as much as we do from seeing absolute levels be where we want them to be. If your consumption standards is improving during your life, you're more likely to be happy than if it's high and static throughout your life.
Okay, so speaking of the Darwinian setting, you had, I think, in an interview, or no, so in the book, right? In the Darwin economy, you had predicted that 100 years from now, Charles Darwin and not Adam Smith would be regarded as the father of economics. And to undergraduate economics students, I'm sure this is quite a statement to hear. So if you could just explain the prediction, I mean, the very exactness of 100 years and why you think we would get there.
Well, I chose 100 years because I suspected my prediction could be wrong, and I wouldn't have to be around to take criticism for being wrong if it was 100 years from now.
That's a smart move.
And I felt a little uneasy about making that prediction for fear it would be interpreted as a criticism of Adam Smith, who is someone I admire more than almost anyone in terms of his intellectual contribution. There's scarcely an important idea in all of economics that isn't clearly anticipated or developed fully in The Wealth of Nations and in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's impossible to overstate the brilliance of his contribution to human thought. But his modern disciples, many of them, I think, don't understand what his contribution was. They think, he said, that if we turn self-interested persons loose in the world and tell them, seek your own ends, that we will get the greatest good for the greatest number. That was, of course, not Smith's view at all. Smith's view would place him in the camp of what we call whiny liberals in this country now. He was in favor of regulating this and regulating that. He thought people were, they seldom got together, but that the conversation turned to a conspiracy to thwart the public good, blah, blah, blah. What was amazing to Smith was that when people pursued their own interests, they often delivered good results for the community as a whole. And that is an amazing idea. I don't think it was widely understood when he wrote that that was true at all. And that's very much in common with much of what Darwin had to say about the evolution of behavior and traits in animals and humans. So if you think about the eyesight of the hawk, they can resolve images at a power that's incomprehensible to human beings. That they were favored because they sought prey by flying above the valley floor. If they had a mutation that coded for keener eyesight, that was immediately selected for, and they accreted. And then now suddenly we've got these surviving hawks that have unbelievably acute eyesight. That's a trait that occurred by no conscious design. It was the individual's interest that drove that to happen. It also happened that it was in the group's interest for that to happen. But as Darwin understood very clearly, the selection pressure is mostly at the individual level. Often that's in complete accord with what's good for the group, as in the hawk eyesight example. But in other examples, I gave one earlier, the evolution of body mass in the elephant seal. What's good for the individual bull is absolutely horrible for bulls as a group. If they could take a vote and all weigh 1/5 of the amount they currently weigh, that would be a win-win for them to do. They can't do that, of course. So my claim was essentially that Darwin saw the link between competition and welfare more clearly than Smith's disciples see it. Whether that's more clearly than Smith saw it, I mean, Smith was less focused on the kinds of arms race problems that I think were more evident to Darwin. So maybe in a certain sense, Darwin did see those problems more clearly. Those are, I think, the really big problems that we need to confront. Climate change, inequality, all those things are systemic problems where the individual's interest points us in one direction and our collective interest points us in another. And those are problems that, for the most part, we know how to solve. We could solve if we understood clearly the structure that gives rise to them. And so I think if more people realize that Darwin saw those problems clearly in a way that Smith did not, that would be a good thing.
So Professor, a sort of follow-up question to this, and Atharva has this question. He asks, what is the optimum solution then for individual and group interests in a Darwinian setting?
You know, the non-human animal species that have conflicts between individual and group interests sometimes have rudimentary ways of organizing to overcome those conflicts, but mostly their powers of communication and law enactment are limited compared to ours. We have vastly greater power to cognitively assess the nature of the problem that's afflicting us and to adopt legislative rules, norms, customs, and the like as means of changing individual incentives to bring them more closely into alignment with collective interests. The preference of mine is to work within the framework outlined by Pigou in the Economics of Welfare in 1920, when he wrote about how to discourage atmospheric and environmental pollution. It was his insight that people pollute not because they derive pleasure from polluting the environment, but because it's cheaper to pollute than not to pollute. it costs money to filter the pollutants out. And since the costs of the pollutants fall on others primarily, not on you, your incentive is to discharge them into the air or water and let that harm occur, because your own interests will be better served by doing that. The best solution, Pigou reasoned, was not to ban pollution. If you think the optimal level of pollution is 0, you're almost certainly wrong. You should at least accept the challenge of explaining to yourself why you're not at home vacuuming your apartment this very minute, because the fact that you're not doing that means dust is accumulating. If the optimal level of dust was 0, you ought to be back there vacuuming every moment you're awake. So the optimal level of pollution is not 0. We should remove pollution until the cost of removing additional units rises to be equal to the damage caused by additional units. And Pigou's insight was that if we put a tax on pollution, automatically that's what happens. The people who can remove cheaply will remove it, because it will be cheaper to remove it than to pay the tax. The people who can't remove it cheaply will pay the tax, and the amount of pollution we end up with will be the right amount, and the people who will be discharging it into the environment will be the ones who should be discharging it, because it would be really costly for them not to do so, and therefore costly for us too. And that's the most freedom-respecting, economically efficient way to solve this conflict between individual and group interest. Now, Pigouvian taxes aren't always practical. Sometimes it's easier just to have a blanket prohibition, a law. So should we tax people who don't wear seat belts in their cars, or just say you have to wear a seat belt in your cars? I once probably would have said you should tax them, but I don't think that anymore. I think now it's probably best just to say it's the law, wear your seatbelt, and pretty soon people stop complaining. They just get in the habit of wearing the seatbelt.
I guess ultimately it does come down to efficient, effective governance, and the fact that voters should vote in a way that you end up with the solutions that you actually want, rather than, yeah. We seem to be going around in the round circle, but yeah. All right. Anyone else? If anyone wants to just unmute themselves and ask a question, then we still have a couple of minutes. Oh, yes. Ashish has something.
It's got nothing to do with economics, but I can't help but ask this question. Who are your favorite tennis players, male and female, and why?
Oh, that's what an interesting question. Well, I was always a big Federer fan. He's in the twilight of his career, it seems, although who knows, maybe he will have a burst of new energy. Most people did not like Djokovic, most people I know. I had a more open mind about Djokovic. When he was interviewed by a thoughtful interviewer, he always seemed very intelligent and to have thought deeply about the questions he was asked about. I later learned that he is an anti-vaccination person. That I count as a severe black mark on his record.
Yep.
And in the most recent Olympics, he, in a peak of anger, withdrew from the mixed doubles competition because he himself had been defeated in the singles competition, thereby depriving his mixed doubles partner of an almost certain medal. What a jerk to do something like that. I will root against him for as long as he plays because of that. A lot of people didn't like Andy Murray because he was brusque. He was always one of my favorites because the interviewers often asked completely stupid questions, and his impatience with those questions was always written in clear terms in his facial expressions and tone of voice, and he always had something thoughtful to say in response to them. I always admired him as a competitor. He was the women, so many great women to admire. I think in the current crop, the fact that Ash Barty has achieved what she did at a height of 5 feet 5 inches with pure grit and determination and individual idiosyncratic spirit is a great thing to behold. You know, she was feeling burnt out. She played cricket for 2 years and then came back and achieved even more than it looked like she was going to be able to do. Yeah, quite amazing.
We have one question about the theory on cascading. So I think that we'll take that up since we haven't really spoken about that a lot. So so Vedant says that he finds the cascading, the theory on cascading excess spending behavior quite interesting. And do you think adding a transaction tax of, say, a certain percentage on the transactions above a certain threshold made on consumptions, would that be a good way to add to the public revenue rather than, I mean, I'm guessing rather than increasing maybe the said income tax, if you could go for transaction taxes, would that be a better way of?
Yeah, great question. And yes, but not just any transaction tax. A sales tax is quite regressive. The reason being that the low and middle income people consume a much higher proportion of their income than the well-to-do.
Yeah.
And so if you tax each transaction, they pay a much higher proportion of their income in tax than the rich do, which is exactly the opposite of what you would want to do if you think income inequality is a problem. My longtime remedy for the expenditure cascades problem has been to eliminate the progressive income tax altogether and replace it with a far more steeply progressive tax on annual consumption expenditure. And that conjures the image of horrible complexity. Oh, I need to prove how much I spent in total each year. Think of all the receipts in a bag and adding them up. No, you don't have to do that. All you have to do is report your income to the tax authorities. We already do that. We could simplify that enormously, and we should, but we do that. You then report how much you added to your stock of savings during the year. Many people already do that in the US and in many other countries in conjunction with tax-exempt retirement accounts. Now we've got two numbers, your income and your savings. Your income minus your savings, minus a big standard exemption, maybe $10,000 a person, is your taxable consumption. It's the accounting identity that says consumption equals income minus savings that lets us administer a consumption tax in this very simple way. And the rate should be either zero if your taxable consumption is below a certain threshold, or very low as your taxable consumption rises. But then when your taxable consumption gets very high, the rate on the next dollar you spend, the next rupee you spend, can be as high as we want to make it without any fear that will discourage savings and investment, because the higher that rate is, the greater your incentive to save and invest. And if you want to attack this expenditure cascade, you have to be able to attack it at its source. And its source is the very top of the income pyramid. It's that group that's been experiencing the huge gains in income and wealth over the past decades. It's those expenditures on yachts and mansions and weddings that are launching the expenditure cascades in the first place. And if you don't have a really big increase in the marginal tax on those expenditures, you're not going to affect their behavior at all. Many people would say, well, they'll still ignore even the highest tax you would put on their consumption expenditures. No, if we go to New York City, there are many billionaires who live in New York City. They could afford to live in houses of 30,000 square feet quite easily. They could buy the whole building and live in it, of 100 apartments. They don't. Very rare is the wealthy apartment in New York City greater than 10,000 square feet. Why do they live in such small apartments? Because in New York City, the real estate prices are so high compared to other markets, everybody lives in smaller spaces in New York City. And so if you're a rich person and you live in 10,000 square feet in New York, it feels like you live in a huge place. And that's efficient. We can attack those cascades quite efficiently with a progressive consumption tax, and that would be my hope eventually to see that happen. I was discouraged that we have seen very little movement toward that, and therefore excited when a few months ago I received an inquiry from a commission in the UK. Would I join that commission to help study the implementation of a progressive consumption tax? I immediately agreed to join that commission.
I believe the European Union has a version of the consumption tax, but I'm not very sure about how they go about the calculation.
Well, they have a value-added tax, which is a sales tax, which, as I say, is regressive in principle. But they raise a lot of revenue with that tax, and they spend it in a way that undoes a lot of the inequality increasing effect of it. So on balance, probably if you take their taxes and their expenditure policies as a whole, they are progressive.
Right, right. So a lot more public spending on a lot of basic amenities, and therefore that cancels out the impact of the sales tax, right?
Yes.
I think Anupriya has a question, so I guess. Professor, how are you on time? I mean, I know we have.
I'm fine.
That's great.
I'm retired. I've got nothing I need to do in the next moments.
That's good to know. Anupriya, would you like to unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So you focused on increasing the income tax, and the major problem in India is that people hide their income. So in order to that, they don't have to pay the tax. So why not actually abolish the income tax and bring a new pay taxes on property?
If you don't have any way to enforce a tax, then of course the tax won't have the effect that you want it to. So I think what should we tax if we can't tax income is a great question. And I don't know the answer to that question in your context. If you tax property, there will be complications and incentive issues there too. A thing to think about is greater investment in the institutional structure that you would need to be able to enforce taxes of whatever sort you decide would be the best ones to levy. Yeah, if you don't have the institutional investment required to collect the taxes, yeah, you can't adopt these policies in any effective way.
So I have another question. So given how affirmative action is often misused, and we do see a lot of that in India as well and across the world, what other options do we have to offset the current social order or the inequalities that are born out of the current meritocratic standards that are practiced all over the world?
The first professor I had in graduate school was named Abba Lerner. He's a very distinguished economist that most people today don't know about, but he was a very original thinker. And he said during an early lecture that the main problem confronting the poor is that they have too little money. And we laughed, that was a clever remark, but we came quickly to appreciate that that was a deadly serious remark. It was his belief that the best way to help people with diminished opportunities is to give them more money. We are finally beginning to adopt that insight in economic policy here in the United States. We in the latest round of COVID relief bills that were approved, given large child allowances to every child below age of 6 gets $350 a month. Every child above the age of 6 and below 17 gets I forget, either $300 or $250 a month, and immediately the level of hunger among in among children fell by more than half in the wake of these payments starting to go out. Having cash allowances like that is an enormously useful step to take. I've always been a great advocate of public service employment. There is a movement in this country to establish a universal basic income, just give everybody as much income as would be necessary to. I don't think that would be the best solution. I think there are many tasks that the private sector has little incentive to deal with. Planting trees on eroding hillsides, cleaning up the public parks, driving old people to where they need to go, staffing childcare centers, all sorts of tasks that would be very useful if they got done, that people with low skill levels can do if they're given proper supervision. So give a small basic income, too small to live on, and if you want more, you can volunteer to serve in one of these public service corps. We're now considering a civilian conservation corps modeled after the program adopted during the Great Depression. There are combinations of cash transfers and public employment that I think could get us a long way to solving the greatest practical problems associated with income inequality and discrimination.
It makes sense. So I just had one question, and this is more for me, or more from the point of view of teaching economics in general. So given your time in Nepal and all your travels, how important, or what is the importance you would lay on simply traveling and experiences and accumulating stories, as you would say, from across the world, and how does that enrich your classroom experience as compared to any course that you could maybe take online, which nowadays it is becoming that much easier to learn so many things with the online medium. How then, and what according to you then is the role of an interactive faculty, so to say, in class when it comes to learning economics? I mean, what more then can you add that you would not probably get through an online course?
Yeah, that's such a challenging question. People had a bad experience when we were first forced to go remotely in the spring of 2020. I was one of 5 people who were teaching a course as a volunteer that semester. The first 3 of us taught in person. The last 2 of us, of whom I was one, taught remotely. And the experience of students at Cornell in the second half of that semester, and I've heard similar stories from schools all around the country, was in general not very good. We have aging professors who aren't very good at technology, scrambling to make Zoom presentations work for the first time, and all sorts of technical breakdowns, and just really the experience was not generally positive. And so people were predicting, well, we learned our lesson, remote instruction is not the wave of the future, as some have claimed after all. I don't think that's the correct interpretation of that experience. I asked somebody, which would you prefer? You're going to take a social psychology course. Would you rather take a course from a middle-aged professor standing in front of a student group of 100 in a live classroom, reading from his 20-year-old notes, the same thing he's told students every year for the last 20 years? Or would you rather take a remote version of that course taught by, say, Tom Gilovich? He's my friend I mentioned. He's one of the best teachers at Cornell. A course where he would have the assistance of animators of the quality that we see from Pixar, of narrative slide builders of the very best caliber, of research assistants who could flesh out the tables and assignments in a way that there are enormous economies of scale in all of those things. Would you rather have that course or the first one I described? Well, maybe I'll take the second course. So I think that market in the end will be something of a winner-take-all market, as many others have become over the last decades. Doesn't mean there's no role for human interaction. There would be the people who are professors now would be assistants at the local level. You have to have people to work directly with. Having in-person discussions is different from having online discussions, although I found that once we discovered how to make the breakout rooms work effectively, the fact that you could assign students to them automatically in a matter of seconds, whereas in a classroom with 400 students, you couldn't really have random assignment of students to groups of 5 to talk about a question that you just posed for 5 minutes and then come back and report. So yeah, I think there will be a hybrid model going forward, but much of it will be remote. Actual experiencing things really does matter. I think I could have read a million books about how context mattered for evaluation, but the fact of having lived in Nepal, of having discovered on the very first days that the human drama played out very similarly there to the way it played out here, was a lesson I couldn't have learned from a book nearly as well as I learned from experiencing it myself. You know, you have good days and bad days. You have a pleasant interaction with others that makes you feel good, an unpleasant interaction with others, you don't feel good. You achieve what you hope to achieve on your to-do list that day, you feel good. You fell short. All those parts of the drama are the same. You were at the time much more at risk of dying of smallpox in Nepal than in the US. There was no smallpox. There were things about being in Nepal that were definitely worse, but the main features of human drama were essentially the same.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here today, and you know, this was excellent. We've had such a great time, and I'm sure, I mean, even the students can't imagine that, you know, we get to start the semester on such a high note that it's going to be a very tough act for us to follow after this. But
well, it was an honor and a privilege to be able to do it. You know, the people who choose careers in academia, most of them could earn more money doing something else. My dean, when I first got to Cornell, was an economist, and he said an English professor once came to him to complain that the salaries of the economists were so much higher than the salaries of the English professors, and my dean, who's named Fred Kahn, said to the English, if you're unsatisfied with your salary as an English professor, maybe you should think of starting an English consulting firm. And he said it was immediately apparent why he had to pay the economists so much, because otherwise they would quit and do high-paid jobs in the private sector, which the English professors didn't have as many opportunities to do. So yeah, most of us could earn more money by doing something else. We choose to remain in academia because we care about the ideas that we work with. So for me, an opportunity to talk to a large group of people in an environment where they'll be exposed to ideas I care about for an hour in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have a chance is a great privilege for me, and I thank you for it.
Thank you so much. And of course, Professor, I am very sure the students have tons of other questions. So we will, if that's okay with you, we can forward them to you. And, you know, you in your own time, if you could maybe write back to them or write back to us, then that would be really nice. But I'll be sure to forward them to you. And
I think the transfer program I used to send you my slides earlier worked okay. I assume I can do the PDF of my book in that same transfer scheme, and can you figure out how to get it into the possession of anybody who wants it?
Yes.
Do I need,
Of course.
would I need to take any other step other than send you the PDF?
No, I think that should work. Just sharing the
Okay,
PDF with us would work.
I will do that as soon as we're off our call.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and this was just wonderful. I mean, I'm just beaming. I mean, there's nothing else I can say. So
Thank you all again. Yeah. What a pleasure for me.
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Best wishes.